Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You're listening to episode 25 of the Muhammad Ghailan podcast with yours truly as the host. Today's episode is going to be a bit more on the technical side. And the reason for it is the subject matter that it's dealing with. I'm going to put on my scientist hat and specifically my neuroscientist hat because of the subject matter. The idea came from an episode that was dropped last Monday from the Mad Mamluks podcast. If you guys don't know about the Mad Mamluks, I highly recommend you guys get to know them. Go check out their podcast. They have a lot of really interesting, insightful episodes. I like their style with regards to their interviews. It's comical at times, it's serious at times. You'll always learn something out of it. And they deal with some subjects that could be controversial. There was the polygamist episode, for example, was one of them. And then they had recently, the one that I'm talking about today is friend zones and gender roles, where they interviewed Kareem Sirajuddin. And, if any of the Mad Mamluks are listening, the hosts, please, guys, go put numbers on your episodes, because I would love to just refer my listeners to you by number. Just tell them, go listen to episode number such and such. It gets kind of hard when you're looking through a list of episodes to try to find out which one was Muhammad talking about. Now, this episode was quite interesting. They talked about men and women and differences and such. And Kareem Sirajuddin is a psychologist, so he was offering his take on it from a psychologist's perspective. Now, during their conversation and exchange, they had a moment where they spoke about brain differences between men and women. I think it was Sim that brought it up, but I can't. It's been a while since I listened to it, a week. So, but at any rate, the subject was probed very superficially, I felt. It was kind of left hanging. They just spoke about women having the volume of a female brain is smaller than a male's brain, and the subject wasn't really addressed, I felt, properly enough for people to walk away with a proper understanding of this matter. In fact, I think what it might have led some people to believe is that there is some sort of implication for how you approach women, or how discuss women, or how women are to be treated, or how their intelligence is to be viewed, or anything like that, versus men, of course. And I wanted to clarify that today. And that's what this episode is about. So, inshallah, after this, our short break with the Fest Singers, I'm going to come back and just talk a little bit about some of the meta-analysis studies that looked at men and women's brains, and what message can you take from them, and what you should not read into them, because pop science can be a bit painful to watch and observe on my part anyway. So this is my small attempt to try to correct potential misunderstandings from that. So yeah, we'll be back right after the Fest Singers.
حاشا لجودك أن تقنط عاصيا حاشا لجودك أن تقنط عاصيا الفضل أجزل والمواهب أوسع بالذل قد وافيت بابك عالما أن التدلل عند بابك ينفع أن التدلل عند بابك ينفع.
Surveying research into brain differences between men and women is a challenge, because it is often the case that we'll find contradictory findings. Now, previous whole brain and region of interest studies typically have small sample sizes and or too much variability in age range of the individuals tested. It should be made clear that when we study the brain differences between men and women in science, the primary goal is not because we want to prove that there is no such thing as men and women, and this is just a social conspiracy by the misogynist patriarchy, or by some people in power to keep the women down, or to negate your self-identity or sense of identity, whatever the case may be. When we're in the science lab and we're trying to understand the differences between men and women, our goal is really to understand things like what makes men more predisposed to certain illnesses than women. Neuropsychiatric illnesses, for example. What makes women more susceptible to other neuropsychiatric illnesses. I mean, if you look at the research right now, and the epidemiological research, you'll find that there are what are known as male-biased conditions. So what, are you going to call them misogynist conditions, like male-biased conditions? So males are more susceptible to be autistic. They are also more susceptible for attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder. They also are more susceptible for conduct disorder, for specific language impairment, for Tourette's syndrome, for dyslexia. I mean, the numbers of males that suffer from these issues, from these conditions, or go through them, they are definitely overrepresented. On the other hand, if you look at the female side of things, females are more predisposed for depression. They're more susceptible to anxiety disorder. They're more susceptible to anorexia disorder, anorexia nervosa. I mean, and none of this is just about, it's just socially constructed or something like that. That's not the case. Now, it should be pointed out, before I get into the studies, I need to make something very clear. The human brain is a plastic organ. What do we mean by that? We mean that not the male, but now I'm going to be saying the male. We mean that the human brain, and brains in general, are able to respond to environmental stimuli, to physiological stimuli, hormones and such, to neurotransmitters. They're able to respond in a way that allows them to change their connective strength, weaken it, to change the number of neurons even if they have to in certain areas of the brain. And so that makes the analyses of human brains quite problematic, because you're dealing with an organ that is not fixed over time. You're dealing with an organ that has responded and changed to its environmental conditions over time. So if you look at, for example, there's a famous one, a study that was of taxi drivers in London. What they found, those of you who are familiar with what it takes to be a taxi driver in London would understand the significance of this. You have to go through a period of time, I think it's a year or 2 years, it's like a whole program where you literally have to memorize the map of London. You have to memorize the streets of London. So this is not about GPS anymore. You have to have that in your mind. Now, these individuals, taxi drivers, were found to have hippocampi. So the hippocampus is the singular word. The hippocampus is a brain region in the temporal lobe, so on the side of the head, that is involved in the process of learning and memory. It's the first place that new information goes in. It gets processed before it gets packaged and processed in its own way so that you can remember it in the future. We don't know beyond that, like, where does memory go? How does it process? Is it like a place in the brain? Is it like a connection? Is it this? There are multiple theories. Nobody knows for sure. But what we know is that you need an intact hippocampus for you to be able to form new memories that are long lasting. So these cab drivers, after they've driven for years, now they find out that their hippocampi is larger. Now, one of the roles of the hippocampus, aside from formation of new memory and long-term memory and whatnot, is spatial memory, spatial navigation. And nothing better than memorize a map and let's see what that does to your hippocampus. And sure enough, we find that it changes. So from that, you should have an understanding of, you'll find studies that talk about not just men and women, but studies that will talk even about, like, is there a difference between the homosexual and the heterosexual brains? You can't know for sure, because again, you have a brain that is changing over time, and it is responding to environmental stimuli over time, and therefore you can't make definitive claims and statements about oh, this brain is definitely a homosexual brain, or this brain is definitely the brain of a heterosexual person. The same thing goes on for men and women. You cannot point at any brain, male or female, that you did not get the identity of and definitively make a statement about it and say, this is definitely a male brain or this is a female brain. Pointing to the difference in volume between the brains of men and women is irrelevant. An elephant has a much bigger brain than a human brain, but an elephant is not doing quantum physics. So brain size is not that important. Another thing, talking about connectivity between the two hemispheres and then drawing from that an implication where we say that, oh, look, the women have the corpus callosum, it's thicker, there are more connections, more axons between the two hemispheres, therefore they are better at multitasking and I suck at multitasking and that explains it. That doesn't explain it. Once again, we're talking about a plastic organ that changes in response to stimuli. People get really excited about, oh, look, we found out the genius portion of Einstein's brain. It's got this particular brain area that is 15% larger than normal or than average. Number one, what is normal? If you, those of you in medicine, one of the first things that they teach you is this concept of what is normal and how problematic it is. And secondly, who says that this is the reason he was a genius? Why couldn't it be a brain area that was developed? And I believe, if I recall correctly, I believe the particular area that was found to be larger was involved in musical ability. And I think Einstein used to play either the piano or the violin. And so it's highly likely that that area just developed out of his playing the musical instruments. So you're dealing with a brain area, that's a brain in general that is changing over time. And so all of these studies are taking brains at a time of death, but neglecting to mention the fact, or they gloss over the fact that there is life experiences behind each brain that made that brain come to the point that it's at today. Now, that's not to say that the whole brain is completely changeable and there is nothing stable. And of course, there are parts of it that are stable. An example of a stable part of your brain would be your neural connections for your motor function. So you don't want your brain to constantly be changing where it's plugging and unplugging its wires with regards to how you walk or how you move things. You want that to be a predictable response from your body so that you can respond quickly in times of high pressure. But having said that, it still has some plasticity. So if you engage in a fine motor task that you've never done before and you start to learn it, at first you're clumsy and then you notice yourself getting better at it and more proficient at it and more coordinated at it, and it just looks smoother and you make it look easy. All of that was your brain now engaged in a process that is synaptic plasticity. It's because it's malleable. It responds to these things. So whenever you read these studies, you really have to keep that in mind. You're not dealing, and the other thing you have to keep in mind is that you're dealing with large groups of statistics, which means there is variability. Now, what is the benefit of looking at large groups like this? What it allows us to do is it allows us to come up with potential treatments that we look at a bell curve, for example, and we say, look, on average, 80% of the population is going to fall within this bell curve. Yeah, we're going to have extremes on either side, but at least we're going to be able to help 80% of the population with treatments, with approaches to things, and that's why we're doing these studies. So we're doing them to help people basically live their lives. There are conditions in medicine that you have to know. Like if you're going to come to me in the hospital and and you have a particular condition for whatever reason, I need to know if you're a male or a female, not because I'm trying to impose any gender norms on you or any social structure or patriarchy or misogyny or any of that stuff. I need to know because there are certain tests I have to perform. There are certain questions I have to ask because that is going to have a direct relationship with whether you probably live or die. So it's beyond that. We're talking now just about pure biology. And so that's the point of this particular episode, is just to talk a little bit about some of the studies. Now, as I mentioned, we're talking about a problem with regard. I mentioned these problems with regards to lifetime changes, plasticity. The other issue that you have to look at is with regards to the number of people that are in the study. There's a paper in 2015 that came out from Tel Aviv. And this paper sought to answer a simple question. Is there a categorical difference that allows us to speak of quote-unquote female and quote-unquote male brains? So we want to know once and for all, almost from the perspective of a newborn baby comes out of the womb, and now we want to know if it's a boy or a girl. It's pretty obvious where you're going to be looking. So can we do the same thing with the brain? There are some categories for that. There's some criteria for that, for us to accept this. First of all, the differences would have to be dimorphic, showing little overlap between the forms of features in males and females. In other words, it has to be either male genitalia or female genitalia, because I need to categorize it like that. So in the brain, it has to be, this is a male part of the brain, and that's a female part of the brain. The second criteria is it has to be internally consistent, where a brain would have only male or only female features. So if I look inside a human body, for example, and I don't know, is this a male or a female? And I only have the torso. Let's say I don't have the lower extremity, so I can't really tell with regards to the genitalia. I can't tell from above. I just have a part of the body, like the torso or the abdomen part. Like, what do I look for? You look for a womb, a uterus. That's one example. If the uterus is there, then you know that's a female. If you don't have the DNA kit, of course, to test all of that stuff. So it has to be internal, and you don't find that in males. So that's internally consistent. So what they did in the study is they analyzed MRI, so magnetic resonance imaging. You guys know about these pictures that you see every once in a while in Huffington Post or Time Magazine or whatever, where they show you these pretty pictures of brains with colors and lighting up with different areas. That's MRIs. So they looked at MRIs of more than 1,400 human brains. Now I want you to appreciate something. To get your hands on 1,400 human brains, where you cut them up, liquefy them, literally use a blender, so that you can measure volumes and changes and things like that, and isolate different parts of it and stuff. And 1,400 brains, that's not an easy thing to do, because you have to donate your body. And this is not something that a lot of people think about. Oh, when I die, I'm going to sign this piece of paper, put on my license. Not only will I be an organ donor, I also would like to donate my body to science. A lot of people don't think about that stuff. So to get your hands on 1,400 brains is hard. So they didn't get their hands on 1,400 brains. What did they do? They looked at a bunch of studies. Each study had a small sample size. And that's really the problem with a lot of these studies. They look at small sample sizes with age ranges in each sample size that varies too much. So that's another limitation of the studies. So what do? You do a meta-analysis, and that's what these guys did. What is the benefit of a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis, for the unaware, you use a statistical framework that summarizes themes from existent literature. So instead of you going out and finding 1,400 brains, you look at all of the studies that are relevant to your question that looked at these brains with the same tool that you were wanting to look at, so MRIs, and quantify and characterize, using this framework, biases and the variability. And this now allows you to reach some sort of reliable conclusion about the matter. So if you and I were to look at individual studies, they will contradict each other by and large. So I'll pull up a study that shows you that male and female brains are different. You'll pull up a study that will show that they're not that different. And then we'll just go back and forth in circles. How do we settle this matter? We do a meta-analysis. Instead of each of us looking at papers with a sample size of 10 or 15 or 20 or whatever, let's look at all of the studies. Pull all of the brains together. Bring all of the raw data from all of the studies, pull them in, and then let's figure out what exactly is going on. And that's what these guys did. That gives you now statistical power that you wouldn't have in the individual studies. And then it allows you to reach a more definitive conclusion about the question that you're asking. Now, what these guys from Tel Aviv University found in 2015 was there was extensive overlap between the distributions of females and males for all gray matter, white matter, and connections assessed. So gray matter is the number of neurons. Gray matter is just the neurons. White matter, this is now talking about the insulation around the axons, around the wires that extend out from the neurons. So they found overlap between males and females. And the connections even. So, women have more connection in this area, men have more connection in that area. Well, they found out actually there was a lot of overlap. So while you might think that, women have more connections over here, I can pull up a bunch of men that have just as much, if not more connections. So that's what it means by having overlap. Most brains, another thing that they found was that most brains were comprised of unique mosaics of features. So instead of looking at a single feature and saying, all right, we have this one single feature, this tells us it's a male. This is something you can give up on now. Well, can we look at a mosaic, a structure, a collection of features, a pattern of some sort? If we can't find one thing about the brain, can we find a pattern of things that will tell us this is a male brain, this is a female brain? Well, what they found again was some patterns were more common in females compared with males. Some were more common in males compared with females. And some were common in both males and females. So yeah, you might find on the extreme ends of the spectrum, on the bell curve, go to the outer end, the edges of the bell curve, and you will find some individuals that are more prominent with particular patterns, and we're like, that looks like a male pattern, this looks like a more female pattern. But most of the time, there's a lot of overlap and crossover that you can't really determine for sure this is a male and that's a female brain. Now, take that another step. What are these patterns? Okay, if we're going to figure out these patterns, all right, what are they? Just for interest's sake. So you look at a study, for example, like one from the University of Cambridge. And these guys did another meta-analysis where they looked at sex differences in human structure. And their reasoning was straightforward. We want to know, why are men having more susceptibility to certain mental disorders than women, and women have more susceptibility to others? What's the reason for that? Well, we want to figure out how to do individualized treatment. So what's interesting about what they found was a lateral asymmetry in sex differences. A lateral asymmetry in these sex differences. What does that mean? I hate jargon and technical language, but you got to use it in these fields. Volume increases in males are mostly in bilateral, so both sides, limbic areas, and left posterior cingulate gyrus, whereas higher densities are mostly limited to the left side of the limbic system. On the other hand, females had larger volumes in areas in the right hemisphere related to language, in addition to several limbic structures such as the right insular cortex and anterior cingulate gyrus. All right, so we've said all of this fancy, Latin this or terms or where these brain areas are. It sounds really smart. What does that really mean? Well, it could indicate the potential possibility that women have an easier time maybe for processing language. I don't know, maybe producing language. It could mean that maybe women have a different way of processing emotional information versus men, but men also have higher densities in other areas of the limbic system, which is also involved in emotion. So maybe their emotional processing is a little bit different. That's interesting. And so maybe that has something to do with explaining why women have more propensity, or they're more susceptible to depression or anxiety disorder versus men, whereas men are more susceptible to ADHD or autism or conduct disorder. Maybe it's a language impairment, maybe because they have a lack in that. All that stuff is interesting to point out from a treatment, medical, biological perspective to figure out certain things with regards to how you operate in the world. But that doesn't really translate from that now, because what's the thing about language? If you look at the language areas of the brain and what they're involved in and the connections that they have, they're close to the motor area. So they're close to the ability for you to move your lips and move your tongue, and so that you can produce this physical action of speaking a language. But what does that say about your cognitive ability to produce thought, to intellectualize something, to understand something, to be intelligent, an intelligent human being who can engage in a discussion and a conversation and understand the implications of it and all that? None of this has anything to do with the studies that we're talking about. We're talking about purely medical interest, treatment for mental disorders, for things like that. But that doesn't say anything about the intelligence of the person, how they will engage in the world, how they should engage in the world, none of that. And so I just, that's really the point of this episode, is just to point your attention to, don't fall for the hegemony of scientific description of everything. This is an interesting time that we're living in. There is an implication, and I believe it's a dangerous implication, from too much focus on, well, can you tell us what is the difference between men and women in the brain? The implication from it that I think a lot of people are not aware of is that you are kind of negating free will in a sense. Free will in the sense that, well, the intellect from an Islamic perspective, al-aql. For you to be legally obligated in Islamic terms, you just have to have intelligence. We don't measure your intelligence at a level that's, if women are a lower level than men, you should expect the Sharia to have some sort of overarching principles that should not apply to them, because their intelligence wouldn't be, if that's really the case, if that's what you're pushing at, which is not the case, is the point behind this. And secondly, you are not your brain. Despite what these studies and the alluring, it's very attractive. I gotta tell you, sometimes I have to check myself. You have to remember that when we look at statistics, you are negating the individual at that point. But then when you approach the individual, you cannot behave, or you cannot expect that individual to necessarily behave as the statistics. The statistics are our attempts to create a structure that allows us to come up with solutions to help population groups. But that is not to say that the statistics, the structure that we came up with, speaks necessarily for the reality out there. That's the danger with the intellect, and that's the danger with theories, and that's what we have to watch out for. So I hope this was beneficial in some sort of way. Maybe we'll talk about it in the future some more, but this was just I wanted to just keep this focused on the neuroscience. If you're interested in the psychology, by all means, go listen to the Mad Mamluks episode with Brother Sirajuddin and Kareem Sirajuddin, and that would be, you'll learn some things from it. You'll hopefully pique your interest about certain topics and subjects. But this issue of gender norms and zones and friend zones, and you can't go back to the brain and then try to build a case rooted in differences in brain structure. If I were to bring you two brain samples and ask you which one is male and which one is female, you cannot tell me which one is male and which one is female. There is no telltale sign. The bigger one could be the female one, and it could just be because this person was a bigger person. The bigger one could be the male one, but the male one could be, on the other hand, also mentally disabled in some way. The size doesn't mean anything. The differences in regions of having thicker or small, you got to look at life experience. You got to look at what this person has gone through. That's why you can't just point at different brain structures, brains of different peoples who live different particular lifestyles, and then justify it according to, well, look, their brain is this way. So yeah, man, I'll just leave it at that. Andalus Book Club. I'm just going to keep plugging this till the cows come home. Tomorrow we're going to have not tomorrow, I guess I'm recording this the night before I do the actual live webinar. And I'm still running through the plans of how to construct my bi-weekly session. I'm getting some really interesting ideas from you guys. Please keep them coming if you'd like to see something there on this bi-weekly webinar meet that I'll have with Andalus Book Club. Should be interesting. Should be a learning experience for everybody. AndalusOnline.org is the website. And just a reminder, if you'd like to support this work, you can donate through AndalusOnline.org for a one-time donation, or you can go to Patreon, where you can become a patron. I've got a few other things going on that side of, on Patreon as well. And the Facebook page and all of my social media links are in the description of this episode. You can find me on Twitter at Muhammad Ghailan, and Facebook at it's also Muhammad Ghailan, and Instagram. Follow me on Instagram, guys. So, anywho, I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and inshallah, we'll be meeting again next week. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.